You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, we got a bunch of us on today to talk about Polestar, and the guest of honor. We got Mario from Symbolic Studies. Luckily, this is one of his favorite topics that he was telling us, so I didn't have to annoy him covering this topic with us. But before we get to him, I would like to have, even though there's a bunch of us here, I'll give everybody a chance to plug their stuff. And we'll just go in order and how it is on the screen. We'll start off with the Headless Giant first, please. Go ahead, sir.
I'm the Headless Giant. You can find me on YouTube. If you want to give me your occult, magical, paranormal stories, you can send me an email at headlessgiantpodcast@gmail.com. I already got a couple for next week's mystical mailbag. So just send those in.
Awesome, yes. If you didn't bring that up, I was going to bring that up. So please, listeners, if you got anything interesting, please send it to my man over there. Thank you very much, Headless. And check out his stuff, and his links will be in the bottom. Teresa, what is up? Let everybody know what your deal is, please.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Check out the Spiritual Gangsters podcast, and also I make fun handmade stuff. So if people want to check out my Etsy shop, I have two. One's called Loyal to the Foil, and one is called Petit Remy for kids stuff. So yeah, check it out.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Teresa.
Thank you.
Ethan Indigo, my man, thank you very much for joining us.
Honored to be here with you guys. This is a great topic. I'm on all the social media, and I'm a writer obsessively, some might say. So, yeah, stoked to be here.
Awesome. I'm glad you're here as well, sir. I always appreciate your point of view on things. And TJ, the numbers guy. What is up, buddy? How are you?
Yo, what's up? You can find me at Contemporary Problems _. You search it, you will find me. I'm on social media and all those things.
Definitely go check out his Instagram. He's got some fire memes and posts. And we got Robby Marx, the OG, in the house. What's going on, sir? Let everybody know where they can find your amazing art and your stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always a great time to sit down with, this circle. As far as my stuff, I'm an artist. I also have a podcast, and I'm currently writing a book. But if you want to check out all my stuff, you can go to my Linktree, which is Linktree RMARX, and that'll pull up all of my goods.
Yeah, definitely go. You know, Robby, I'm going to be honest, I did not realize how many shows you have on your podcast now.
Yeah,
I was like, yo, this guy looks like a regular, like you would almost think it's a regular podcast. Not that it's not, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
that those are all guest appearances.
Yeah,
those
are all me. Yeah, on other shows.
I was like, yo, that's a lot. Holy crap. Good for Robby. Good for you, man.
That's the meta aspect of it, you know?
Yeah, that is crazy. The guy has his own podcast just from being a guest on other people's shows. I mean, who's got it better than him?
He's in demand. That's it.
He's like, I don't even have to record my own stuff. Good for you. So, yeah, definitely go check out Robby Marx's stuff, everybody listening. And finally, to the man himself, Mario from Symbolic Studies. Please, Mario, for all the newbies and people who don't know who you are, just let everybody know what's up.
Yeah, for sure. You can find all my stuff at symbolicstudies.com. I'm all over the place, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, things like that. And basically, I put out content mostly around the astrological signs during the sign itself, following the tropical system. But I do post occasionally about other things, including stuff related to the Polestar, the North Star. Yeah. This is easily one of my all-time favorite subjects. And I'll say that as information has sort of been revealed to me regarding the Polestar and its nature, it's really been a paradigm shift. I'll just put it that way. It's been a huge, huge paradigm shift for me. And so I feel like I'm still going through it. And, you know, we'll be able to talk about some of the key aspects or whatever, but it's such a game changer to understand sort of its symbolic value that it would take multiple episodes to kind of get through everything. And I have literally dozens of books on the topic. Some of them I've definitely read through, some I'm still waiting to get around to and everything else, but we'll see what we can talk about here. And I think to kick things off too, I'll probably just talk about my journey coming to sort of become interested in the pole star. What do you think?
I'm excited.
One thing I did want to ask you real quick, Marion. Sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering, not to put you on the spot, how long have you been doing this for? Doing this, this whole symbolic studies thing for?
As a channel, it's been around since 2020. So it was Scorpio season 2020 when I posted my first video. But I've been collecting symbolic dictionaries and reference books since about 2008, I would say.
I don't know why. I just assumed you were out much longer before me, and I guess really, maybe a few months or 6 months. Or, I don't know. Not much.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why. I just always assumed you were around for a few years before me, because I was gonna be like, this guy's probably been at it for like 7-10 years now. My bad.
No,
That's so
I
fun.
wanted to. I actually really wanted to talk about conspiracy, fringe, paranormal stuff for many, many years, and I felt like some of the topics I wanted to talk about were actually maybe too controversial for my blood personally. I didn't want to put myself out there, talk about all these things. And so kind of a happy compromise was talking about symbolism, and I became really interested in symbolism just throughout those years. And finally I was like, I'm learning so much. I feel like I'm almost absorbing too much, but I'm not putting anything out. And I feel like that can really be like an imbalance that you can have. You can consume way too much. And if you're not like talking about it or doing something with it, if you're not taking sort of any action with that information, I think that it can kind of be detrimental. So I decided to kick things off in 2020. But so for me, the pole star, it's so fascinating and it's so interesting, and it wasn't on my radar to really look into it until about 2014 or so, 2015. And the reason why is because I caught that first wave of flat earth information that was coming out. Whatever you might think about it, right? I was curious about it and I wanted to know what people were referring to with it. And actually there's a guy who became really well known in that community. His name's Eric Dubay. And I was following his blog before Eric Dubay had ever mentioned anything about, flat earth at all. And so he used to talk about Freemasonry and occultism. He would talk a lot about Atlantis and whatever. And he put out his first blog post about it. And I was completely like, I didn't know what to think, actually. I was more like stunned, right? I was like, this guy's really talking about this. This is actually a thing. I respect his other work and information, but it kind of came out of left field for me. And I downloaded his first book that he put out. It was a PDF called 200 Proofs. And it was about all of the anomalies that basically sort of exist with like standard cosmology, right? What we actually live on and everything else. And so that really started my journey with like getting into just the different content creators that were putting out videos that were at least questioning sort of what we're living on and like what the deal is. And that really opened me up to like ancient cosmologies and how ancient peoples saw things and whatever. And it's way more holistic. And at the end of the day, my big takeaway from all of that was that we, at the very least, just do not live on what we've been taught, like in school, right? So that's at the end of the day, kind of like, for the most part, how far I'll go with everything. There's a lot of other things we can talk about with that, but I was pretty convinced that at the very least, like what I was taught isn't the truth. And when you start getting into like geocentrism and the nature of heliocentrism, what it is to be a heliocentrist and be taught that the sun is the center of all things. When you start learning about all of that stuff, one of the things that actually comes to like the surface as like a talking point, something to like look into is the fixed stars, the stellar, tradition, basically, where in today's world, most everybody, and I put out a ton of information about astrology, right? But today's sky clock would be the sun, the constellations around the ecliptic, right, around the path of the sun, the wandering stars, right? And what I realized is that this wasn't always the sky clock for people. And so you can make the case, and certainly there are cultures that use the moon as their central sky clock, right? They go based on a lunar calendar. Their holy days fall based on that cycle with the moon. But there was a sky clock before that, and it was the fixed stars basically. And all of the fixed stars go around a central star, which is the pole star, which is the North Star, right? And so the constellations that are really close to the pole star are Ursa Major and Ursa Minor and Draco. And these constellations were like really, really important way back in the day. And so they've kind of been occulted, or a lot of people just aren't aware of like their significance and value and everything else. So as I started researching, you know, things related to like alternative cosmologies, geocentrism versus heliocentrism, all that, the pole star became kind of a topic of conversation, and it would just be brought up more because it's the center of the heavens basically. And so that started my sort of journey with wanting to know more about the star itself and like everything that it represents. And so over time, I started picking up books that were related to it. Over time, I got really interested in the tarot as well. And one of the sort of interesting things was my trip to India. I went to India, and it was interesting to see just like, you know, the swastika out in the wild as an example. And I met this young guy, and without me really prompting him in any way, he basically mentioned that his guru teaches like a geocentric model, that he's not a heliocentrist basically, which I thought was like fascinating because I was reading about it at the time. And so there's a lot of polar symbolism over in the Eastern world. And so slowly but surely I started kind of getting like some traction, and I was starting to like understand what the pole star represented more and more and more. And then I realized that there were occult circles, black magical circles, that really revered the pole star as well, and really had almost like a framework that integrated some of these northern constellations and everything else. And I was really fortunate to have a friend that owned a small bookstore in Portland, Oregon. And she knew that I was kind of pulling at this thread, this northern polar sort of thing. And she would literally see books, set them aside for me, and let me borrow them, and basically just let me read them and skim through them. And she turned me on to like 3 or 4 really, really key books that completely changed my trajectory with everything. I also, at the same time, was getting really interested in wanting to know about Lovecraftian magic, basically Lovecraftian black magic. And I knew that this was like definitely a thing. And it's almost like its own sort of like scene, basically. There's a lot of authors, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of information out there. And I was like, what is this all about? And because I wanted to know more about occult history, I felt like I needed to kind of give it my due diligence and like start reading some of this material. And my friend, Christy, she let me borrow a book, and it's one of the Necronomicon books by this guy named Simon. And this one's called The Gates of the Necronomicon. And what you actually see on the cover is Ursa Major, which is one of the main constellations that goes around the pole star. And I read that book and it blew my mind, because basically sort of the claim in the book and what other authors have said is that Lovecraft basically kind of updated this ancient pantheon for modern sensibilities, pretty much. And that he was encoding information that had to do with like sort of the spiritual and metaphysical framework of these ancient peoples that held the pole star in really high reverence. And so this early tradition is called the primordial tradition. I think you can refer to it as the primordial tradition, the northern tradition, the polar tradition. There's a lot of overlap with Typhonianism, the Typhonian tradition. There's a whole northern correspondence with that. And so what Lovecraft did, seemingly, is that he basically took this old tradition and he updated it, right? In a way that like modern people would be interested in, right? And so he did that through this cosmic horror sort of motif. And so everything that book is about, Gates of the Necronomicon, talks about how he was encoding sort of northern symbolism into his work. And so that really was a huge sort of game changer for me in just like my understanding of things. Because in that book, they also talk about the pole star in ancient Egypt, what it represented in ancient Egypt. They talked about Ursa Major being like the thigh of the bull or the thigh of Set in ancient Egypt, how it was used in these different rituals, like the opening of the mouth ritual. And so it gave me this whole new expansive way of looking at the pole star. Funny enough, the cat's out of the bag, but the guy who wrote it is Peter Levenda, and he was using this alias of Simon.
Right.
And Peter Levenda would later write books that basically covered other aspects of pole star symbolism pretty much. And so he wrote this book called The Dark Lord, which gets really into that, along with more Lovecraftian information. And he also wrote a book called Stairway to Heaven, where he really, I think that's one of the best sort of intro books if people want sort of like a good read that's like an easy read that talks about a lot of this stuff. And he basically talks about all of these different cultures and like kind of like secret societies and religions and stuff around the world that basically consider the pole star to be like the gateway to like another plane, pretty much. And that's one of the things that you'll find out when you look into it, is that because it represents the center of the heavens, it's basically taken on the symbolism of like a door or like a portal or something along these lines. And the way I put it is that
I had a quick question about Peter Levenda, though. So his other books was about esoteric Hitlerism and Nazi occultism.
Nazism,
yeah.
Right?
And
And Sinister Forces too.
I was going to say Sinister Forces as well, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, you've got the swastika in there, and then he goes over and sort of covers the other side of it, I guess. I mean, there's some sort of a crossover there, because you've got the Nazi symbolism in the Ursa Major going around the pole star. So,
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is what you'll basically find out, in my opinion. And I was excited to do this show, by the way, because this is the Occult Rejects, and I have so much information about the occult side of polar symbolism and the North Star that I don't really cover on other shows, because it's just, I don't feel like it's like that appropriate. What you'll find out, in my opinion, is that the true left-hand path, in my opinion, is actually polar in nature. And so once you understand that, it makes a lot of sense. People like to think that the sort of dualistic sort of thing is solar and lunar, and that's kind of just how it is. There is something to be said about that. There is this contrast between solar and lunar, but what predates all of this is actually polar in nature, right? And so I'm inclined to think that guys like Aquino were well aware of polar symbolism and sort of all of its implications. Peter Levenda is pretty well networked with people, and he's in that world, the black magical occult world, right? And so what I'm finding out is that the left-hand path completely overlaps with polar symbolism in a lot of different ways, because there's a lot of symbolism associated with the northern sky and the pole star that corresponds basically with the Dark Mother, and a lot of Dark Mother symbolism. And I also think it's interesting too that when you look into circumambulation rituals, which is like you walking around a central totem or something, like in Mecca, right? That's like my classic example. If you have your totem on the left-hand side, that is a polar rotation, and that's actually more contractive. It actually reminds me a lot of Saturnian symbolism, and I know you brought up Saturn earlier. Would love to hear your thoughts about all of this. And if you go clockwise, that's more of a solar rotation, and that's actually more expansive. So it's interesting to think that if there's a left-hand path correspondence with polar symbolism, it kind of lines up even with just the rotation of going around that central point of pivot, right? And this relates to the dynamic of the pole star. It's called the pole star because it's like a symbolic axis or axle, right? So if it's the wheel of heaven, the hub of the wheel would be the pole star, the North Star. And basically my understanding, the way I put it, is that there are realms above and below, and they're all connected through their center. And so I think that the chakra system is a really good sort of interface for this, right? I'm sure I've mentioned it here before, but you have 7 chakras, symbolically, they're all connected through that central axle, which would be your spine, right? And so this is how it works in your body, but this is also how it works on a larger, grander scale. So that means that the pole star is along the lines of that axis. And this axis is also referred to as the world axis, or the axis mundi. And that basically is like probably the most important thing about pole star symbolism, is just look into the world axis or axis mundi, because it's a complete game changer. So I see that the pole star is kind of like a keystone symbolically as well, because it exists at the top of the firmament, right? And so that arch, the royal arch, right, is almost symbolic of that firmament, the dome of heaven. And the keystone would be right there in the middle. And there's overt keystone symbolism that relates to the pole star,
right,
you know, and everything else. And so my understanding is that ancient peoples had a reverence for the pole star and the northern stars, and they had more of a local understanding of everything. And so everything was much closer to home. And so sort of as they had this reverence for the center of heaven, they also had a reverence and an understanding of the center of self, and sort of like that whole entire dynamic. And what I like to say too is that, you know, there's a sort of golden thread that exists between the center of self and the center of the cosmos. So know thyself and you'll know the universe, right? And so there's a relationship symbolically between the middle of a wheel, the middle of the heavens, the middle of earth, and the center of self. They actually symbolically are all completely related. And so you want to get to that center point within, right? We've talked about some of this stuff as well. But, you know, that was a whole rabbit hole going down the Lovecraftian and black magical sort of tradition and like how it relates to the North Star. And also too, World War II, I don't know if I've said it on Occult Rejects before, but there's so much polar symbolism with World War II and World War I. It's absolutely like completely off the charts. So as an example, you know, Poland was invaded, right? And so I just think that's kind of an interesting sort of thing, Poland. You mentioned the swastika. The swastika is Ursa Major going around the pole star, right? It's the Allies versus the Axis, right? You will only hear the word Axis as it's associated with evil. So now Iran is the new axis of evil, basically, right? And so I'm inclined to think, basically, that some of what was happening there literally had to do with sort of smearing polar symbolism, basically, seeing that people don't talk about any of this stuff because it's so powerful. I've even read authors who've suggested that the great occult war is between polar and solar forces. But that's basically the thing, that they are completely at odds with each other. And there's a lot of things to say about that. Like that's a whole sort of weave or rabbit hole as well, for sure. And so over time, you know, I started understanding more and more about like what was going on up there and how significant and important it is, that I really just made it a focus. And so I started collecting books. Any book that talked about the North Star, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, I was interested in. Eventually, what I found out is that there was a great shift symbolically from polar symbolism to solar symbolism, and that there were polar deities back in the day that later became solar deities. So I think that we live in a solarized world that was built upon this polar tradition, basically. And my sort of research these days has led me to basically kind of a camp of philosophy where you're going to hear more people talk about this stuff. And it's called perennialism. And so Rene Guénon is often kind of considered like, you know, one of the key figures in this tradition. And he really is probably the best author to read, the clearest author that talks about sort of the implications of like the polar dynamic, this polar to solar shift. And what I really appreciate about him is that he talks about the metaphysics and the difference between living in this primordial sort of tradition and living in modern times, basically, which is basically to say, you know, how people thought like well before heliocentrism, but before like solar worship became a thing. I think with like heliocentrism, I truly think it throws everything off. I think that it's not harmonious. It doesn't look that way to me, at least. And everything becomes way too masculine as well. So the feminine tends to be really suppressed. And there's a lot of feminine symbolism that associates with the pole star as well. And also Ursa Major and things like that. So that's kind of my, like, I guess somewhat in a way, like personal journey or whatever. But the pole star has been referred to as the guiding star. And so this was the preeminent main star with early sea navigation. If you knew where the pole star was, you knew where north was, which means that you knew at just where you were going generally. And if you're following a different constellation, it's only in proximity to the pole star that you know where you're going, right? And so all of the fixed stars go around the pole star once a year. And so that's why it was used as an early sky clock as well. And so it was a different kind of time. And actually, I know I've brought this up before too, but I think these sky clocks are encoded in the tarot. The star card represents the pole star. That's the 17th card of the major arcana. The 18th card of the major arcana is the moon card. That's more of the lunar cycles and everything, and the lunar calendar. And then after that, you have the sun card. And so all three of these cards in a row talk about three different sky clocks. In my opinion, I kind of refer to them as like three different symbolic ages, right? And this is different from like the great ages or whatever. But the pole star has a relationship also with like what it means to be in a dark age and what it means to be in a golden age. And so what Rene Guénon says is that literally in the golden age, this is when people had this sort of respect and understanding of the center, right? And in the dark age, which I think we're living in a very dark age right now, right? I don't know exactly at what part we're at in it, but he says that the difference is people have lost basically the sight of the center. People are now ungrounded and they're not still, and they basically aren't literally acknowledging anything related to this sort of supreme center. And so the idea is that all things emanate from a sacred center, from this inner sanctum, and then all things sort of return to it, not unlike a torus field, basically, right? And so the pole star symbolically represents that because of its position of where it's located. And so this has major, major implications symbolically, because it means that everything came from the same place. Everything sort of is an echo or a remnant or something along these lines, right? A fractal of this original sort of thing. So so that's kind of been one of the trippier things to sort of understand, right? When you read these authors who really get into the world axis and everything else, everything relates back to it. There's almost nothing that you can, nothing you could talk about. There's no planet, there's no symbol, there's no myth or anything that escapes this sort of dynamic, because it has kind of been viewed as this original sort of dynamic.
Well, when you talk about the ages, isn't it also important to notice that the primordial age, where you had mounds and these worship sites that were all connected to this sort of northern symbolism?
Yeah, exactly.
That's very important to note, because that's the center of their cultures, and ever since then it's been more diffuse, and there's far more wandering from those centralized locations.
Yeah, absolutely. So one way of looking at it that people have put forward is that humanity started in the center of Earth, that humanity started in the north, and that there was a migration away from the north. And some people say that this had to do with some sort of catastrophe or a cataclysm or whatever. There's lots of variations on this idea, and that the north would relate to paradise, or it would relate to the Garden of Eden, right? And so there's this idea, and you'll see old maps, right, where in the northern part of Earth that there's like a central mountain. And so this central mountain interfaces with the world axis. Mountains, pyramids, pillars, the idea of a lodestone, it's the same thing, basically. When you're talking about the center of Earth, the idea is that this is where heaven and earth meet. So there's like a symbolic bridge, or there's a symbolic stairway between the above and below, basically. And that the pole star would just be right above it, right? North Pole, North Star. And so basically, when people symbolically, even, I'm open to it being a symbolic interpretation, migrated away from the north and set up new sacred centers, they're basically emulating the original sacred center. So Mecca, Jerusalem, whatever sort of holy site you're talking about, whatever pilgrimage location, symbolically, it's like a pilgrimage to Eden, or it's like a pilgrimage to that inner sanctum in earth, right? And when you look at these different holy locations, there's always this idea that it's where heaven and earth meet. That's always like a common theme with all of them.
A perfect example is the Betelgeuse stones. So these are the stones that are sacred to these different cultures around the world. One of the most famous Betelgeuse stones is the Jacob's Pillow. And Jacob's Pillow is where he was supposedly sleeping on top of this mountain and had the vision of the stairway to heaven.
Right.
And it's right along those polar lines, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, Nick, if you don't mind, I have an image of Jacob's ladder, and it's the 16th slide that I have in that PDF.
And it was also Osiris's spine. They said that the earth was hung upon it, and basically, you know, it was attached to the axis mundi and basically held the earth in the heavens.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this old idea that I've come across several times. I know it's in Ovid's Metamorphoses as well. There's this idea that heaven and earth and all of the elements were fused together. And it wasn't until this axis mundi central pillar came into existence was there space between the above and below. And so this central pillar or world axis was believed to be the thing that actually separated heaven and earth, and then also connects heaven and earth together, right? And I think this is actually what the magician, he's basically acting as a central pillar in the first card of the major arcana. The number 1 is symbolic of the world axis, just the straight vertical line, right? It connects heaven and earth. The magician has a wand, which is very much related to world axis symbolism. He's pointing it to the heavens in one hand, and then he's pointing down to the ground in the other hand. He's basically saying, I am the central pillar in the house of God. I connect all that is above with all that is below. And he actually corresponds with the Hebrew letter Beth or Bet, which literally means house, and actually goes back to the Betel stone thing. There's a whole entire relationship with that. But yeah, so here's Jacob sleeping on the left-hand side. You can see 3 pillars. One pillar, generally when you see, this is from Freemasonry, generally when you see 3 pillars, there's going to be one that has an obvious sun on it, one that has an obvious moon. So then what's to say about the central pillar? It's polar. One is solar, one is lunar, the other one is polar. The polar pillar is the one that's actually truly transcendental and actually truly goes to other planes of existence. And the symbolism is so obvious once you know what you're looking at. But you see the central pillar literally is breaking through the clouds, and then it's surrounded by 7 stars. These 7 stars, if you didn't know any better, you would probably think maybe perhaps they're related to like the 7 wandering stars. But actually, the original 7 stars of enlightenment, in my opinion, is Ursa Major, right? And that the symbolism was attributed to Ursa Major first, and then I think kind of have gotten shifted around, right? And so like the Pleiades in the solarized world, in the solar mind, that kind of has taken on a lot of Ursa Major symbolism, in my opinion. And then clearly you see the ladder, you know, going through the clouds there. So if you want to go to maybe slide 13 and 14, if you don't mind. So there you go, another Freemasonic tracing board, 3 pillars. You'll see that there's a 7-pointed star in the middle, and that's what the ladder is ascending towards, being associated with that central pillar. Notice that it's also going towards east as well. So there's a whole entire correspondence with east symbolically being related to what's been referred to as cosmic north, that it's almost a veil. It's not the east that you're going to see on a map. It's actually more of a central location. And sometimes the sun has been used as a symbolic reference to the pole star. And I have a quote that we can read later from Peter Levenda, but he basically says, and I agree with him, that the sun is almost in modern times a blind for the North Star, that the North Star is the original sun. That's another way of putting it, right? And so I think that that's absolutely worth considering. And I think that it makes a lot of sense. And if people want more information about that specifically, I did a presentation called The Rising Sun. And so people can see that on my YouTube. And I really get into the nature of that and how the sun, when it's being referenced in different works of art, allegorically, etc., it doesn't necessarily doesn't mean the sun that rises in the east and sets in the west. It actually is more of a reference to like a cosmic sun. I would say sometimes you can refer to it as the invisible sun or the black sun even. The black sun, in my opinion, is basically the stationary sun. It's a reference to the world axis and the pole star. The main sun, that's what goes around, rises and sets every day. The black sun, I think, is this immutable sort of central sun. And that goes back to some of the Nazi occultism stuff, right?
There could be something more to the East reference and in terms of an electromagnetic correspondence, because there's a guy named Crow 777 who has done a lot of work with sun and telescoping and taking videos of the what he calls the invisible sun.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that.
It's being confirmed by other people who, are using the same methodology to sort of film it. You can actually get on camera this sort of second sun idea and prove that it's not just lens flare.
Yeah, I think no matter how you want to slice it, absolutely. I'm really starting to think that just one sun does not make sense.
Be in a elliptical, there have to be two foci. So we're in an elliptical orbit around, or one way or the other, right? So there have to be two foci for there to be an elliptical orbit.
Right. Yeah, no, there's something to be said about it. And I've seen his work for sure. So
of course, I wanted to say the Egyptians too, they would bury people on the west side of the Nile and they associated eternal life with the east. But as I've heard it, towards the sun being the eternal, disk and so forth. Not that it may not be related to the polar aspect, but the non-physical dimension east, as you're pointing out.
Right. Yeah. If you want to just go to the next slide, so number 14. I've shown this before. But this is a Freemasonic lodge in London, and they openly acknowledge that this is the pole star, that this is the North Star, that they don't hide it. And so you see that there's a ladder going to that central star. Notice that it's a 5-pointed star. And then notice that there is the zodiac going around it. So this is the thing to me that was really fascinating just over time, that nobody in astrology acknowledges that all of the stars in astrology go around one star, And so to me, that's like a huge thing. And so I try and, bring that up or make people aware of that. And so, so my opinion, and just because I'm looking at the zodiac and just brought this up, if everything is expressed from the center and returns back to it, it's something worth considering, something that I've read multiple times now. And I think that this is absolutely true. I may have mentioned this at some point, but basically, there are several authors who have put forward that there are cultures who have documented information about their early zodiac being in the northern sky. And once they became solar, they exported the mythology from the northern sky to the path of the sun. There's a guy named John Major Jenkins, and he has a book called Galactic Alignment, and that's what he talks about. He talks about the ancient Chinese people having 8 constellations around the pole star. And then once they became solar, they shifted those constellations literally to the path of the sun. And then they added 4 more constellations, giving them 12 constellations. And so I've heard variations of the theme. So my opinion is that the origins of the zodiac come from the northern sky. I think that makes all the sense in the world. So the same way humanity migrated from the north and potentially spread out, the same thing has happened in mythology. And I'm inclined to think, actually, that perhaps all of the mythology that you see in the night sky came from a northern location, that it originated up north and got exported over time. And so it's kind of a big claim, but to me, it makes a lot of sense on multiple levels, because the density of what you can learn about these circumpolar constellations, which means that they don't like dip below the horizon when they go around the central point of pivot. It's staggering. You know, I've been reading about it for years, and there's more and more and more stuff that I'm learning all the time about it. So like Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, it's been referred to as the thigh of a bull. It's been referred to as the thigh of Set. It's been referred to as a plow. It's been referred to as reindeer, a sleigh. It's been referred to as a boar or piglets, sailors, a dark mother,
Bears.
the coffin of Osiris. What was that? Bears, exactly. Yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah.
The great bear and the little bear. And so it really is kind of a mind-blowing sort of thing to consider. If you want to go to
now, before we leave, I was going to add, as far as the Freemasons, if you look in the Mackey's Freemasonic Encyclopedia, they talk about the 5-pointed star with the effulgent, beams coming from it, very much like that is the star of the Masons. It's the star Merca. So
that's what they refer to it.
Right, and they associate it with Isis and the Dog Star as far as Sirius B. But I think on the occulted level, they're more referring to the Pole Star.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a surprising amount of information that I've learned too that relates Sirius B with the North as well. In fact, it's been referred to, the Dog Star, right, has been referred to as the eighth child of the Great Mother of the North, is one way I've heard it put, right? So there are things going on there. What I kind of say, or how I understand it, is that it's not unlike a wheel. I brought up wheel symbolism recently on here, I'm pretty sure, but like the wheel is a really good metaphor to understand for a lot of different reasons. But the external part of the wheel is related to division, multiplicity. The internal part of the wheel, the hub of the wheel, the axle of the wheel, is related to supreme unity, basically, right? It's immutable, it's stationary, it's kind of like timeless. And so all things outside of that center are subordinate to the center, that the true hierarchy is the middle. We tend to think of a hierarchy just in terms of like a pyramid, right? But going to the top of the pyramid is like going to the center of the wheel, basically.
Right.
And so all holy locations are subordinate to the original location. So the same thing I see it with the night sky is that all stars are subordinate to the pole star, to the original transcendental star, basically. It's the star of stars. There's no other star like it, basically. And so
sorry to interrupt. If I may add that an excellent way to perceive the pentagram, the 5-pointed star, is through traditional Chinese medicine, or the 5-element theory that really is the basis of traditional Chinese medicine, where every herbal formula starts with at least 5 ingredients, and there's this whole 5-element unfoldment in the natural world that goes along with the yin yang symbol, what we call the yin yang symbol, which is actually the grand ultimate pole.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that. I'll
one other thing that's interesting is the correlation with all of the stuff you've said and the Bach saga.
Yeah.
The Bach saga just says everything that you just put out there, all in very clear terms about this sort of northern hierarchy, or this northern kingdom.
Yeah.
And talking about how they laid out the meridians based off of the different kingdoms that made rings around the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah, no, you got it. And so I consider myself personally like allies with the Bach Saga people. And I've done shows about the Bach Saga. The thing that they don't like about me is that I put the North and a lot of the symbolism that I'm talking about right now as like the supreme sort of originator of things. And they don't like that I'm not just a Box Saga guy. Like they want me to acknowledge like just the Box Saga. And I'm like, no, there's a lot of other claims of where the origins of humanity are. In fact, I think it's healthy. You know, I think it's healthy for a people to have something in their backyard that they say, this is where our Adam and Eve came from. This is where we bridge the gap between heaven and earth. I think that's a very healthy thing for people to have. And so the fact that people will defend that and say that, no, it's in our backyard, that's cool with me, because that just fits with sort of what I'm saying here with all of these other cultures basically saying a very similar sort of thing. So they're all sort of mirroring this original dynamic.
Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask, Robby, when you mentioned that star, was it Merca or Merak that you said?
I think you said Merca.
Merca? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I heard too.
Okay, no, it just was like, I was like, oh, it's America.
Robby, I think you muted yourself or something.
He might be muted. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, it just reminded me of America. And I wanted to ask real quick to Mario, is there anything, or you might be touching on this later, but is there anything that you can think of with the pole being like red and white? Because all I just think of is like the barber's pole, you know, and then you mentioned Poland earlier in the show, which is very associated with red and white colors. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that real quick.
Yeah, no. I mean, not specifically with the red and white, but where you see a pole, it is related, you know. And so whether it's the maypole, the barber pole, for sure, I think corresponds with that. And also, one of the things I've heard people refer to this original tradition as the mystic pole tradition. And you'll find that a lot of sort of messengers that have preserved wisdom from a previous age, a lot of times they're very much related to the pole. Like they will literally carry a walking stick with them. They have a shepherd's crook, which I think is very much related to this idea. The fool oftentimes has one or two poles with him. The green man oftentimes has a walking stick with him. Sometimes he'll have a tree or a branch like on his shoulder or something like that. So the pole definitely in all of its sort of variations, I think it just relates to this original sort of idea. People refer to this as well. Go ahead.
It could go back to the barber pole, because the barber was more than just a barber, right? He did all sorts of surgeries and all the rest of that stuff. So that could be related to the rod of Asclepius, because you've got sort of the snake going up the pole.
There you go.
Would be
Yeah,
for the barber.
it could be a concentric representation instead of crossing, right? They're intertwined around the pole. Sometimes a barber pole is red, white, and blue. So even to me, it could be like magnetism to like the different like polar opposites, like forces, right?
Totally. Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely.
If I may add on the mystic idea and the idea of grounding, a big part of Tai Chi practice, or grand ultimate pole practice, is what it really means, is actually to imagine connecting with the North Star. And that being a whole balancing process. Buddhism, in many different meditation techniques, starts with the idea of single pointedness, right? Sometimes many meditations might have the idea of a single spark. And this spark is of course the pole of our energy. In every mandala and yantra or visual meditation tool, there is a center point, and it's very important to consider in the meditation process. There is also, I think, not necessarily explored, but the symbol of God, or maybe one can infer godliness or a meditated mindset. Forgive my stutter, but the circumpunct, the Greek symbol for God, is the center point, or the single point,
the monad,
the circle, the monad, excuse me, and is really a simple, but in that simplicity, a profound meditation tool potentially as well. So I think that the center pointedness and being centered, right? All this has a lot of psychic value, if you will. And I also wanted to add to that psyche idea that the Trinity that you mentioned, I found profound, not only in the more physical sense as you explored with the polar, solar, and lunar from the tarot, but there's also the internal or mindset Trinity that these might correspond with. And the first one that comes to mind is the priest, the king, and the philosopher. So I think there's just a bunch of internal or meditative or self-development ideas through that center point, single pointedness. Thanks for letting me share that.
Yeah, dude. No, you freaking got it, man. You totally get it. The circumpunct is interesting for so many different reasons, because I agree with you. It's related to the center. Isn't it interesting that the circumpunct in today's world is the symbol of the sun? Because the symbol of the sun has really taken on a lot of the symbolism that was originally associated with the pole star. And so the sun in today's world, if you're a heliocentrist, that is the central pole. Part of what this is all about goes back to what people have called axial symbolism, is that central point is the point of pivot for whatever that system is, right? And so if you're a heliocentrist, the point of pivot is the sun. If you're more of a geocentrist or something, then the point of pivot would be this central pole, right? The point of which all things revolve around, which has this relationship with the pole star. And so in a lot of newer symbolism books, what you'll find is that the circumpunct oftentimes is related more so to the sun than anything else. You will also see the same thing with the quartered circle, right? Which is just the cross with a circle around it. And a lot of people say in modern symbolism books is that it's the solar wheel. Everything in modern times has been overemphasized to go along with sun worship, pretty much, in my opinion. And I think a large part of this has to do with heliocentrism, and I think in large part this has to do with the church and Christianity and things like that as well. So one of my favorite symbology books actually talks about the centeredness that you're referring to with everything, and how that relates to so many different symbols. Mountain symbolism, world tree symbolism, the circumpunct, the quartered circle, things like that. And so one of the books that really kind of changed the game for me is called the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. I recommend it all the time because it's one of the easiest to get symbolic dictionaries on the market. It's super cheap, but the entries are really good. And I realized that I love that book so much because they reference Rene Guénon all the time, and he's like the polar guy. And so he is referenced more than any other author or researcher in that entire book. And so reading that book really got me sort of used to thinking about this sort of center idea, inner sanctum, and sort of what that represents and how you see it in so many different things, just like you're saying with meditative symbols and mandalas and things like that. So yeah, excellent stuff. So what I see is that the circumpunct and quartered circle, these are originally polar symbols, not solar symbols. That's just my interpretation of things.
Now, I would like to add, when you go back and you look at the original layout of Atlantis and Atlas holding up the heavens, basically being that pillar,
yes.
Atlantis itself are those circular, the circular motion around the center point, and then having a temple on every circular axis. But perhaps even because there were other instances where we've had other polar stars based on the shifts and the movements of the heavens. And at one point where there was actually a dual star that was the polar star, but perhaps the sinking of Atlantis was actually just the cosmic shift and the change of the pole star.
You know, one of the things I'll say is that I'm actually wrestling with whether or not the pole star has changed or not. And the the precession of the equinoxes and everything else. Like I've heard that. I have charts with the older pole stars and things like that.
Right.
And I've talked to some really, really knowledgeable people who no longer buy that the pole star has shifted or changed. And so I would say that I'm personally on the fence. I don't know what to quite think about that.
Right.
You know, so it's just something to consider, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
The interesting thing too. So in today's world, in modern times, if you see a depiction of Atlas or someone draws Atlas or creates a statue or something, Atlas is going to be holding the globe, literally a sphere on top of his shoulders. The earliest versions of Atlas, he's actually holding up the firmament.
Right.
So he's holding up the vault of heaven.
Yes.
And I think this is interesting because that would align him with world axis mundi symbolism. And guess how many daughters Atlas had? He had 7 daughters. And so this would be Ursa Major, this original 7 stars of enlightenment. And so what's happened, like I was saying earlier, is a lot of the core symbolism associated with the North kind of has been dispersed all throughout the rest of the night sky, in my opinion. And you will see this with the Pleiades, because the 7 sisters are basically the daughters of Atlas. And when you actually look at the mythology, one of the fascinating things is that when you look at the Pleiades, even though it's generally referred to as the 7 sisters, there's actually only 6 main stars, but they have a myth about the missing 7th daughter, right? The myth exists because it's a transition from Ursa Major to this other place. And so for more heliocentric minded people, the new axis, I think, exists from Taurus to Scorpio, basically. That this is sort of the new axial bridge to the other side, which to me is more like a counterfeit or a copy of something that existed in the northern sky, personally.
Well, do you know what the first bone right below your skull is called?
Atlas.
Yeah, and it's holding up
the
your
dome.
head.
Yeah, that's right.
Funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what's interesting too is that all of the stories and all of the myths and everything else in ancient societies were found in the constellations. So that was like the memory of the civilization. So it's literally holding up the head, which is the whole memory of the world, which would be all the stars.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's beautiful. One of the principles, if I'm not mistaken, of the circumpunct is that the center can be basically anywhere, and the circumference is basically limitless.
Yes.
And the Native Americans have a beautiful idea, I find, that it just reflects this. For instance, if you go to the Hopi Reservation, I think it's San Francisco Mountain is the center of the universe. And if you go to another tribe's place, they have another mountain, usually, that is the center of the universe. So it's just an interesting idea that relates to that.
The San Francisco mountain range is like 100 miles away from Hopi territory.
Certainly, no, but I'm pretty sure they have it as a very revered place, and I think it's their center point.
That's where the Kachinas come from. Is they come from the San Francisco mountains towards the mesa.
And isn't that also where they hid out during the last Earth changes underground with the ant people that took care of them and helped them out until they could reemerge?
It is.
Actually, I think that was in, there's another place more close to the reservation. As I was told, it's something like the Blue Canyon or Blue something or other, where they came out of. So maybe they entered in San Francisco.
Right, and they call that the navel of the...
There you go. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting when you first mentioned the pyramids, Mario. It made me think I was like, oh, my new favorite Earth theory is pyramid Earth, because I think it just represents like the shape of the Earth. It's got the 4 corners, and then the top is held up like a canopy, sort of, but it's representative of that. And same with the mountains, right? A mountain being like your center point wherever you're at.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, the idea of your temple or lodge or whatever being the center of the universe is really common. And I almost would say that if you're not kind of imbuing that on your sacred space, you're kind of doing it wrong. And so that's why the lodge has that pole star right on top of it. Right. So speaking of actually, Nick, if you don't mind going to the 17th slide, it's related because it's another 5-pointed star. But there you go, right above. There you go. So my understanding is that this was the symbol of the opening to the other side in ancient Egypt, the duat. And so this is the 5-pointed star that represented sort of that gateway or threshold between realms, right? And there's a woman named Judy K. King, and she wrote a book called The Isis Thesis. And according to her decoding of the hieroglyphs, she basically says that the ancient Egyptians had this idea that when they die, and maybe this was just a certain sect of people or for a certain period of time, but she basically said that their idea was that when they die, their soul goes to the north and exits the cusp of this great horn of a bull. And basically, this would be like the toroidal field, pretty much, right? So the torus field has an opening above, it has an opening below. If you look at the Earth's magnetic field, it looks like a torus field. We get the northern lights because of this dynamic of this magnetic opening at the north, right? And so I just think it's interesting that they preserved, the 5-pointed star in that Freemasonic lodge as being the gateway to the heavens. And the Egyptians basically had the same thing, according to this woman, that this was the symbol to go to the other side. And the number 5 too, the mathematics behind the 5 and literally the pentagram, the shape of a 5-pointed star, it's truly transcendental. It exists between the physical realm and the spirit realm, right? And so there's so much to say about that just in general. But it makes a lot of sense that this would be sort of the icon that crosses that threshold, which, by the way, just want to say that there's maybe it's completely balanced. I don't know, but there's a lot of symbolism related to the heavens or heaven being in the northern sky. There's also a lot of symbolism, and it's really one and the same in my world, of the underworld also existing in the northern sky. That they're basically, it's like synonymous kind of in a way. But that's what a lot of the black magical stuff that I attached to early on when I was reading about it. That's kind of, they attributed more of that stuff to the northern sky. But it's the same thing. You'll see lots of god symbolism related to the northern sky in the pole star. You'll see a lot of goddess symbolism, a lot of king and queen symbolism. So it really is kind of like encompasses all of it, in a lot of ways.
So, go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, just real quick. This depiction of the 5-pointed star looks so much like a belly button to me. Which would be like, honestly, it's a tether between mother and child, and
the navel
between the heavens and bringing a soul earth side, right?
Well, that's a great point, because when you look at some depictions of Nuit or Nut Nut, and she is the firmament, she's like the night sky. Yeah. Her belly button is right there at the very top of that arch. Oh yeah, a lot of times it is.
I
she arches her back.
That's right. Yeah. Oh man, yeah, well, crazy, right?
I was gonna say, now when you look at Mother Kibble, or the mother of all the gods, Mother Kybel, when they would venerate to her, they would walk the left-hand path with the mountain in the center.
Excellent.
Up to the peak of the mountain, and then when they reached the peak of the mountain, there was actually the cave of the Divine Mother, and you would enter into so you're actually ascending the pillar, and when you reach the top, you're going through a portal, essentially.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't realize that the Kaaba cube is feminine.
Yeah.
It's completely thoroughly feminine. In fact, if my understanding is correct, Kaaba means house of the mother, or like house of the great mother, something along these lines. And the black veil over the cube itself is called the kiswa. And it's literally a veil, and veil symbolism corresponds with Virgo and a lot of goddess symbolism, basically. So the Kaaba cube is thoroughly feminine. And what I've heard as well, there's a great author. His name is W.H. Mueller. He wrote a book called Polaria. He really got into some of this information. He basically says that the reverence of the Kaaba being the mother got exported into Europe as the Black Madonna.
Right.
And that's why the Black Madonna worship was like on the underground in Europe and really took root in France.
So now with the back to Mother Kibele, she was represented as a meteorite that had fallen from the heaven, and she was basically this black, almost obsidian type stone that a lot of people believe was a sort of a lodestone. But nonetheless, when she went to Rome, they carved the goddess and left the face empty and just put the black stone in it. So there is and then within the Kaaba stone as well, you open that veil up and there's like a silver vagina essentially,
right,
that has broken up pieces of a very similar type black rock that Muhammad and it had been stolen away and brought back. And so this black rock symbolism of this divine feminine energy is something that you can trace a lot of these schools back to.
Exactly right, dude. You totally got it, man. Yeah, for sure. And even literally Black Rock, like the company, that's a lodestone reference, right?
Oh, for sure.
And so even
that makes me think of the Philosopher's Stone too, is alleged to be a black rock, a black substance, right?
There you go. Yeah, I completely agree. I think the Philosopher's Stone is basically a central stone sort of concept, and there's a lot to kind of pull out with that for sure. Have you seen videos, Robby, of like people who go to Mecca and stuff, and then they're basically like putting their face into like the silver yoni there, and they're like going nuts
and kissing the goddess herself.
Yeah.
I've talked to a couple of Muslims about, the rocks that are in there, and all that I can get from both the guys was they're just magic rocks from heaven. So
just magic rocks from
heaven. Aren't they all walking around it too?
They circumambulate it to the left
7 times.
Seven times, yes.
Banishing ritual.
What I've heard, you might already know this, but what I heard is that the lore of the stone is that it used to be white,
right?
And that as man has kind of fallen from grace or sinned or whatever, that it's turned black over time.
Yeah, the tears of the ages and the pain of the time, and have turned it that obsidian black. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of 7. If you just want to go down to the next slide there.
Sure. Real quick, before we change this, I just do want to add with this star, without the circle around it, I have seen that that star's like on the ceiling of the OTO lodges. It's for, I think the Gnostic Catholic, for the Gnostic Mass. I think you have to have that on the ceiling, and their ceiling is like pretty much black or almost like extremely dark blue, and we'll have that star. And interesting enough, when I was at the Sistine Chapel, they told us before Michelangelo painted the ceiling. That's exactly what they had on theirs.
Oh, wow.
Was that star with the same colored background. And I was like, that is interesting.
Yeah, that is.
I believe the throne for the royalty of England sits upon a rock. I forget what it's called, this rock, which is just always struck me as... Thank you. That's always struck me as very... very strange how often humanity extols these things upon rocks, and there's the royalty doing it.
Yeah, that stone that you're talking about, that basically they inaugurate the royalty under. They drag it out from the Castle of Edinburgh whenever they're going to inaugurate the king or the queen, whoever it is. But that is they say that it's the same stone that goes back to Jacob and Jacob's pillow, and basically the creating Jacob's ladder, the Axis Mundi. Yeah.
Oh wow. It all relates. That's awesome.
One interesting thing about the Hebrew altars is that they had to be made out of stone that was never touched by any chisels.
Right. Yeah.
Shape.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. You'll find the correspondence with these holy locations, which are subordinate to the original sort of holy location. The stone symbolism is always generally sort of there, and sometimes the central stone will be like a standing stone, right? Or like in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount has a big stone underneath the dome of the rock, right?
Right.
And so there's a hole in the middle of that rock, right, which goes to like the abyss, and there's all sorts of stuff going on down there.
Yes, and Jerusalem also has the highest number of standing stones in the world.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. And so sometimes
isn't that rock supposed to be where where Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac?
The pillow itself?
No, the Dome of the Rock.
The Dome of the Rock, yes. And that altar goes from Isaac and Jacob all the way back to that being the original altar of Adam and Eve, where Cain killed Abel.
There you go. Yeah, right. There you go, man.
And that was and then that was also where Adam and Eve had built that hinge, where that altar was, because they were watching the heavens, was said to be the exact point that they had been cast out of the Garden of Eden. So that is directly related to the pole star.
Please tell me more about this hinge. I don't know if I know about that.
Yeah, so there's these stories that when the divine couple was cast out of the Eden, essentially, that they immediately set to watching the stars, because they were told that they would know the time of return based upon the position of the stars. So they took 5 rocks, back to the 5 again here, and basically built this hinge of 5 stones from 5 sacred mountains in accordance with the directions that they brought them from, and then set up that original altar that became the altar for Isaac, the scapegoat, as well as being the place where Solomon's temple was eventually built.
Right. Wow. Yeah, because the pole star too has been very obscurely and not commonly referred to as the hinge star, because it acts as that point of pivot, obviously, right? And that's really interesting too, the point where Cain killed Abel, because what you're doing when you're kind of establishing a pole is you're creating something for the people to revolve around. And so you're creating something that's a stabilizing force. And so there's a lot of symbolism with the pole and the pole star relating to orientation, right? You're giving someone a point of orientation. And this point that gets established, that is way more of a thing for sedentary peoples. I recently was reading about nomadic peoples versus stationary peoples, right? And sort of like the cultural and symbolic difference between the two. It's really, really fascinating. And Cain basically represents more of that, the sort of agrarian culture.
Right.
Yeah. And Abel symbolically represented more of a pastoral
hunter-gatherer.
Yeah. And that he apparently represented kind of like symbolically nomadic peoples, right? People who travel and this and that. So Cain killing Abel, I've heard, is the agrarians killing the nomadic peoples, basically, or like preventing them from moving.
Right. And Cain killing Abel, because the Lord, quote unquote, didn't take his sacrifice of the best, of the fields. Basically, the appropriate sacrifice being the oldest, that was, unblemished, that was the purest in factor, was his brother Cain. So he was actually substituting Cain for his offering of the field.
Right. Wow. I love all of that, dude. That's really interesting. Nick, if you don't mind, just go into the next slide. So I see all of the numbers relating downward. There you go. A lot of numbers relate to the north. I would say one of the key ones is 7. Symbolically, what I've heard people say is that it's almost as though the current world tree, if there was one, is 12 branched, but the world tree in the primordial tradition was 7 branched. The number 7 is a really, really important sort of thing. And I actually think you get the number 7, the glyph, the shape of the number 7. I think you get it from Ursa Major. I think that's what it goes back to. And so what you see here is Ursa Major on the right-hand side. This is how you locate the pole star. If you're ever looking, stargazing, if you can find Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, you just look at the end of the vessel and then you just create a straight line and you will see the pole star, the North Star. And the pole star is one of 7 stars that makes up Ursa Minor. It's the tip of the handle. So when you're actually acknowledging this movement, it's almost like 2 vessels revolving around this central point of pivot. It's almost like they're pouring water from one to the other, which makes me wonder actually if this is being encoded in like the Temperance card in the Major Arcana, because you have 7 stars of Ursa Major, 7 stars of Ursa Minor. The Temperance card is actually number 14. People have said the number 14 is actually kind of a symbolic northern number. And
that
so
makes me think of the reference to the waters on the firmament.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
100%.
The
Exactly. Yeah. There's a ton of watery, oceanic symbolism associated with the northern sky. Like, it's insane, even including like in the Vedic world, the rishis, the 7 sages coming from the north, they each have a correspondence with one of these stars. So in their world, they literally, I've come across information, literature that says that their 7 sages come from the north, and they each one of them corresponds with a different star in Ursa Major. So something to consider. But if you go to the next slide, you'll just see a simple sort of illustration of how this creates the swastika. It's Ursa Major going around the pole star. If you look at it once a season, this is what you're going to see. That Gates of the Necronomicon book has a whole entire section in the back where they basically, it's completely outdated because the book is old, but they basically have these rituals where you conduct the ritual when the great bear is hanging from its tail. And this is a reference to Ursa Major, right? Ursa Major hanging from its tail, going downward. So the tables in the back actually tell you when that's going to happen. And if you just go to the next slide, you'll see the number 7. So just showing you, I think that the number 7 glyph comes from that. And there's so much evidence to suggest that this is the case. So if you go down one more, you'll see just an old map that I found at a friend's place. Right. So this is the Arctic, so the North Pole, and you'll see that it's septentrion. So sept is a reference to like septenary, as in like number 7, right? So septentrion literally is a reference to the original 7 stars of the northern sky, basically. So if you just want to continue scrolling down, you'll see that septentrion equals north. And if you keep on going, what I've read from some authors is that sept is actually a reference to Set as well. If you go to the next slide, and Set has a huge relationship with the northern sky as well. He's either directly associated with Ursa Major, or he's been said to hide behind Ursa Major. One of the things I've come across is that a lot of the oldest deities come from the northern sky, are associated with the northern sky. And one of my good friends who got into a lot of this information years and years before I ever did, we disagree on a ton of things, but one of the things he said was, all people's supreme deity is a northern god, unbeknownst to them for the most part, but that it all goes back to that because that is the supreme unifying center, basically. And so there's no more powerful, potent place that the gods could come from. And I think this is why as well, Lovecraft, in his work, he was referencing the most ancient primordial of gods, which come from the north, which I think predate and precede a lot of newer gods. So I would say that the northern gods came before even like the planetary gods, that the planetary gods are actually a newer creation compared to northern gods.
The first Bible assimilation was simply called the Septuagint.
Right.
Ah, there you go. Right.
Out of Alexandria. And I often wondered why that was such a powerful thing that they could just use that number. But now in seeing this and what they were alluding to with just saying the Septuagint, that The 70 chapter, I think, is what it means. So it just goes right to the kind of center, if you will, of what you're saying there.
Well, interestingly, you're talking about the idea of these original northern gods basically coming before the planetary gods per se, right? And if you look back at Mother Kybele and how she essentially started out in Phrygia and then, transversed into Greece, and eventually they bring her into Rome. The Sibylline prophecy says, bring this Southeast Asian goddess into Rome. Right. And they set her up on Palatine Hill immediately. And she becomes the mother of all the gods of Rome, which are the planetary gods. And if you go back, she was originally this polar god, like I was talking about, the mountain and the cave and the portal, that transitions and they bring her in. And then all of the planetary gods start to take place, ritual places within the worship of Mother Kybele in Rome.
There you go, man. Yeah, that's perfect. Exactly right. That makes a lot of sense to me. And
right.
we'll be getting into a little bit more of goddess symbolism as it relates to the North too, because it's so relevant. If you just want to cruise to the next slide, very simple. 7 days of creation, 7 heavens, 7 seas, wonders of the world, 7 sages, the Hermetic principles for what it's worth, the Mithraic degrees, et cetera, right? So the number 7 is so significant. And I see it that it relates more to this northern business than like any other place that I've come across. And so when you go to the next slide, there we go. When you're looking at the 7-pointed star and you see all these 7s around, I think it's all encoded northern symbolism stuff. I think this is a reference to the North Star, basically, like almost a clear reference to it. And the feminine symbolism is there with that Vesica Pisces, sort of in the middle. Babylon, the Babylonian symbolism on like with multiple myths completely corresponds to northern symbolism, in my opinion. In the next slide, I have the Whore of Babylon as well. She's always depicted with what? A 7-headed beast, right? And so it's all northern, in my opinion. And then if you go to the next slide, it's just a simple star card, right? But this is from Lon Milo Duquette, who's, an occultist, author guy. But the card corresponds with Aquarius. And so one of my favorite videos that I put together has been correlating a lot of Aquarian symbolism with northern symbolism in the pole star. And so to me, when you're making a reference to this card, that is the northern star. To me, it doesn't make sense that it's basically any other star, considering when you sort of like understand the hierarchy of things, right? That's one thing that I'm really trying to acknowledge these days is the spiritual hierarchy of things and kind of what's more primordial, what's more central, what came later, what's related to, more modern sort of stuff or whatever. And then the last 2 cards here, I just have more star cards basically, but you'll see that it's a tradition to show the central star surrounded by 7 other stars.
7, yeah.
Right. And so to me, it's pretty clear. And then she has the 2 vessels. It just reminds me of the dippers and everything else. And then the Crowley version. So he has 3 sort of spiraling, 3 or 4 like spiraling stars, and they all are 7-pointed. Since you're looking at the slides, one of the things I definitely want to show people is slide number 3, 3 and 4. So, I mean, no one has to take my word for any of this. I know you guys are down. You guys are adding a lot of great information, to the conversation. But what I did was I actually put together a PDF called Polar Symbolism, and I list 27 books that I've either completely read through or have done like, I basically skimmed through for certain terms and keywords and whatever that have really like helped inform me about all of this stuff. And so there's actually a lot more information out there than people realize. And so you can find that on my website, symbolicstudies.com, and it's on the top banner when you go to the site. But if you go to the next slide, I just basically took out those books and just put them here, so that people can just take a screenshot if they're watching this and they don't want to go to the website.
That's a great list. Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million other things we could talk about. I have a handful of quotes and everything else, but I think, I don't know. You guys get the idea. We can talk about whatever else from here if you guys have any questions or, further sort of insights.
Did anybody have anything they wanted to add?
I'll add real quick something that actually Nick and I forget who all else we did the show with. We were looking at the pillar, which is etymologically related to pole, of course, the pillar's relationship, and there is another trinity that they represent, which I think it can be best summed up, or a great way to look at it anyway, is preservation, creation, and destruction. And these three pillars, if you will, or forces, are in a sense a trinity also, and they're set up to deal with the chaos that is set, right? And that being the unsaid fourth in that, and also a good aspect, or in Egypt anyway, a positive symbolic aspect of Set was that he is symbolic for the plow, and he would, and you mentioned some of that symbolism earlier related to it, but he is very chaotic and comes into that, new or yet to be planted land, and presents that chaos, which you fill up and make nice.
Right. Yeah, I actually I interviewed a modern day Setian maybe like a year and a half ago, and that's on my YouTube channel if people want to hear that conversation. And I got interested in Set because of the Northern correspondence with everything. And what this guy said, and what I've read as well, is that back in the day, and there's different traditions that basically do a very similar sort of thing, but that if you had an adversarial sort of deity that you wanted to sort of combat, that you wanted to have a god that was equally as chaotic as that adversary, or more primordial than that adversarial figure. And so Set was sort of the chaotic god for good, basically, is kind of how it was explained to me, pretty much. And actually, Nick, if you want to go to the next slide down, I have a quote about chaos and Set and everything else. And so this is from Peter Lavenda. I'm pretty sure this is from his Dark Lord book. And he says, chaos is associated in Egypt and in the Near and Middle East of the period with Set, and with Set Typhon. And the star to which the creed refers could only be the pole star, with its 7 circumpolar attendants, the Big Dipper, or as it was known in Egypt, the Thigh of Set. The very important statement concerning one star in the company of stars of whose fire we are created and to which we shall return implies the extraterrestrial origins of humanity, and by extension, its ultimate destination. This star has been identified as the sun, of whom the father is the sole vice regent, but I believe this is a blind, as were the 7 planets of Mithraism. For the real sun, which is the immortal pole star, a sun that never rises or sets, but which sits unmoving directly overhead.
Right.
So I think he really, to me, it's interesting that he's the guy that's kind of coming out with a lot of this stuff clearly, because I can't say I agree with his whole body of work and things like that. And who he's connected with and things like that. I don't know too much about him on that level. I've heard things here and there. I've heard whispers and stuff, but he definitely knows about this symbolism. And I think there's more people that do than you would realize. actually, it's so interesting. I'm starting to talk. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Emily Moyer, but she does some pretty good work, and she's really into the DJ techno scene. And we had a conversation on her podcast, and she's exposing me to like several DJs that really put a lot of polar northern symbolism into their artwork and stuff like that. And it's really interesting to me that this would even be the case. And even in like the metal world, which is mostly what I listen to, there's a lot of bands that have had pole star songs or alluded to it in like different ways, and like it's kind of like has been part of the artwork and things like that. So it's more of a thing than people realize. You just have to kind of go out and read some of this material, or you know, want to know more about it, basically.
So now also if you look at the work of Kenneth Grant and his Typhonian Mysteries, he talks about the 7-pointed star and relates it to Isis, how we were talking about the dog star relating to the pole star earlier. But he also says that that 7-pointed star being the goddess, that the center of that 7-pointed star, the hub of the star itself, is Set.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I got into Kenneth Grant because of all of this. And one of the things, I haven't like completely dove into his like entire body of work, but I do appreciate what I have read of his. But if you look at what is it, the Night Side of Eden, you know, it's all about going to the Tree of Death, basically crossing over the Klipothic tree and things like that. And basically he associates Doth, which has a correspondence with death. He corresponds Doth, as do other people, with the North. He makes that very clear, that the Doth as the hidden Sephiroth that will take you to the other side is associated with the North, which makes it just a ton of sense.
The portal.
It's the portal. Yeah, exactly. So let me see here if there's any key quotes that I should read, since you still have it up.
Another Peter Levende.
Yeah, there's several. Let's see. Maybe go to the one right above that one.
Renee.
There you go. It's just another Ganon. Yeah. So if solar symbolism has an obvious relationship with day, polar symbolism for its part has a certain relationship with night. And it is significant in this respect that the midnight sun should have, in order of sensory phenomena, its literal representation in the Hyperborean regions. That is the very place of origin of the primordial tradition.
Right.
Yeah. So the midnight sun being a reference to some of this. And then, yeah, there you go. I mean, like I said, there's a million other things we can pull at, but I think we covered some pretty good ground.
Yeah.
TJ, did you want me to pull up your stuff? Oh, sorry, I caught you off guard there.
No, I was on mute. Yeah, sure. I've just been sitting back, just soaking it all in, running it through my own processor. Just like, it's been very nice. It's been very good. Very good presentation.
There we go. Switched right over.
Right off the hop, what I found interesting too, that I found out while that image was there, was the circle with the starfish in it, or like the 5 divisions of it. So you would take 3.14 pi or pi, like continued on, divided by 5 to get like a length or a clue into what each of those lines would represent. And the number you get would be 0.62. So polar equals 0.62. And you kept bringing that, you kept like referencing the way that polar is this very dark kind of thing, like, and could be connected with the black magic. I tried to keep it a little more positive, but black magic also equals 62, and like Poland equals 62, which is like just ridiculous.
I think it's interesting. Then, punk equals 62.
Interesting.
Punk.
And then that equation at the bottom there is the equation for gravity equals 62. So with the polar and the gravity, that's like,
wow, very
cool. And then on the right, music is just a very good representation of the number 65. and 65 would be like 6 the harmony, 5 the energy, so like harmonizing the energy, whereas 62 would be like trying to add trying to add harmony to the emotions, which would like, it's almost like emotional, like hexing the emotions. And then also with like solar, it equaling 214, that's like Valentine's Day, just music, love, like just like that kind of thing that's interesting with it.
The singing of the spheres.
Yeah.
That's really interesting with the 62.
And then I wonder if the P and the polar, because we have the Christogram, and we're going to break this down a bit. And the way that I set up my charts too, we're going clockwise around. So your east would be Aries on the left. That's the only thing that would be reversed. And your north would be like the Gemini Cancer. And there's that. So the P. So I was just like pondering the P and the S. We can go to the next slide. And then I realized this one too today that just kind of blew my mind, was like S, it's like 8 is hidden in Satan as well, which is very interesting. But then S is the 19th letter, and the 8th prime number is 19. And then like, yeah, the S is just like that dynamics. It's like the night and the day, which is more the solar. So that like makes sense in that regards. And we keep going. There's only like 2 more.
Well, and it's also the sine wave.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
which is the cosmic water that the age of Aquarius is pouring out.
So then if you embark on this journey and you go through the death or the tower of the P, and then you go on your quest and you pass the test, you triumph or whatever, there's 2 possibilities after that. So you either become you, but you yourself is the ego, and you have to let that egg go. And you can't spell any Q words without a U. And when you put the Q on the chart, that's right where Ophiuchus would be, which is the letter U. So it's about like, if you just become yourself and the ego, you almost like have to go through the process again to like relearn the journey. Or you've kind of passed it, if that's what you see like Ophiuchus to be as well, where you've pulled the snake apart and you've like flipped the egg, essentially, kind of thing.
I love that. I have to comment on this real quick.
Yeah.
So my understanding of Ophiuchus on an esoteric level is that it's actually completely northern and polar, and it's almost like a symbolic escape from the zodiac, from the solar zodiac.
Right. Right.
Right. And so I've heard it be referred to as like literally an exit from the zodiac, or a bend in a river, something along these lines. And when you look at the ecliptic and the constellations along the path of the sun, Ophiuchus is clearly more northern than the other constellations. And I think it's interesting that Ophiuchus is also ruled by Mercury, and Mercury has so much polar phallic pillar symbolism. It's completely nuts.
Right.
And so I feel like Mercury actually is like a good gateway into some polar symbolism. Or if you start looking into this stuff, Mercury is going to come to mind over and over and over and over for various reasons. And just to expand on that briefly, I've heard that, or at least what I put forward, is that with Mercury, there's lunar, solar, and polar symbolism completely baked into the story of Mercury, in my opinion, from what I can gather, that there's this triune sort of dynamic with Mercury. But yeah, Ophiuchus, I see this as kind of like what you were saying. I kind of interpret it as like following your true north, following your true authenticity, getting to your center.
Well, also, when you look at the zodiacal wheel, as far as Cancer being that northernmost point, the Freemasons consider the keystone to be Cancer. And within Judaism, the keystone is considered to be peace or shalom.
There you go. Yeah, that was something I was going to mention too, right? And so Royal Arch Freemasonry, that's one of the best videos I put together, in my opinion. Very short, very brief, but I talk about this whole entire dynamic.
Nice.
The Keystone Northern sort of thing. And then just real quick too, you brought up the tower. To me, the tower card is really modeled off of the Tower of Babel. And oftentimes it's said that there was 7 steps to the tower, right? And so it seems like with alchemy and with this transcendental sort of dynamic of going to the northern sort of opening, that the 7 is always included in so many different ways. 7 steps or 7 veils. I know it's even been said, like in Islam, there's like, I think it's 70,000 veils between you and the face of God. That's like one way they've put it. But anyways, continue, dude. I'm appreciating what you're putting out there.
Yeah, and that's even why I like arrange the wheel in that order too, is like the Masonic arch and like kind of reference to that's why like I set it up that way, and it's clockwise, just like easy to understand. The 2 lines at the top there, it has the wall is the summer wall, and that just adds to the egg and the eggo because it's Humpty Dumpty. You sit on the wall, you go, you have a great fall's awesome, but it's like kind of the little riddle of it. But and then it takes all the king's horses, Sagittarius, and all the king's men, Aquarius, to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Nice. So it's that dark process at the end there. So that's like the summer wall that just fits with the portal or the polar and all that stuff.
Also, Cancer takes place for the most part during the 7th month of the year, which is
July. Oh yeah. And then P would be 16 like 1 plus 6, so the 16th letter P, so that adds to the 7 as well. But if you worked on your ego and you process it, you become one, like you become the one, or you like pass the test and you not like don't think you're like the coolest for passing the test, and you don't like get in your ego or whatever, then you become the UV light, and then you would figure out what that light is. It's like you'd get your glow. You would be the one with that glow. And then just like shorts or long story short, it's just like after that, it's the W, you get the win. At X, it's another cross similar to the T, but it's where you learn how to swing the axe. It's the axis. It's where you learn the exit. It's the same with like Jack and the Beanstalk. With the swing of the axe, he defeats the giant. So it's like it's like the W is like you think you win, and then a boss comes back one more time, and that's like the X, and it's like the final thing. And then the Y, you learn why you went through all that, and then when you go through this process, the very end, the Z is much like the Omega, where you just see the beauty. Like for me, when I like understood this, it was like I could see like the quantum strings of the universe like orchestrating together, kind of thing, like in like peaceful, like naturist meditation, but kind of thing. But it's like just really saw the beauty, and so that's just like the process of that. And then it's like PS, so it's like the polar solar kind of thing. So like that's the little secret, or it's like the little extra thing at the end, right?
I like the polar solar.
Postscript.
Another one on that end, the phallic, I think I wrote it the right way, is like if you have your north-south and your east-west and you labeled it P, you get PNS, right? Which would be phallic. And then the other way you get so.
And with the cross in there, you almost get the I.
And if you weren't sowing, like it's like that would be your solar. So it's like the sun, the day, you like need to rely on the sun for your crops and your sowing and that kind of thing, as well as stitching.
Since Egyptian times, sowing the seed is, not only farming, but also sexual.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
You, TJ. Good. That's the last one.
That was it. Just a short
nice,
little.
dude.
Yeah, thank you for
that. Was fascinating. I was going to say, too, that the egg is, of course, maybe you mentioned this, is symbolic of a point, right? It's the beginning point of a life being, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely.
And it's the circumpunct as well.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, there's even like a symbolic pole in the egg as well.
Right.
So there's like symbolic polarity in there. So the positive and the negative end or something. I think this is why some hero twins like Romulus and Remus, they're said to be born from like a cosmic egg sort of thing, even though they represent this opposing sort of force or whatever.
Well, and it was what was it, the goddess Ishtar Adana, that they rolled the egg up out of the river and took care of it, and then but in her star is the 7-pointed star, back to polar symbolism again,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in there too, I just wanted to bring to light is that there's a number of ways to kind of break down your correspondences, and one of the ways that I've come to appreciate lately, because I think there's a lot that makes sense with it, is that what Rene Guénon says is that traditionally solar peoples have their new year in at the spring equinox, right? And so this is what astrology acknowledges, Western astrology, I guess. And then he said that polar peoples, which I think this is really interesting, acknowledge their new year right around the winter solstice. And I'm like, that's really interesting, because that's right around where modern Western people celebrate the new year. And then I'm like, wait a second. I'm like, this actually makes a ton of sense, because I see a lot of polar symbolism with Saturn. And like I was saying earlier, the Golden Age has a huge correspondence with all of this stuff. And it's been often said that Saturn ruled the last Golden Age. Right. And I also put out a presentation that basically alludes to the idea that Saturn was once feminine, and that there was sort of a fall from grace over time, and that now we look at Saturn as like this old man and whatnot. But there's a lot of sort of symbolism that suggests that maybe it was more feminine in nature, perhaps even a Chronos, right? And so there's a big northern sort of thing with that. And he also says too that midnight, as I mentioned earlier, the midnight sun, that midnight corresponds with the north as well. And I'm like, well, goddamn, that makes a lot of sense too. When you look at a compass, north is right up top. It corresponds right there with the 12 of midnight, right? And then also the sort of celebration that surrounds midnight is New Year's, right? And this is all happening during Capricorn, which is actually ruled by Saturn. And then we have this other little holiday called Christmas, and Santa comes from where? He comes from the North Pole. So between Christmas and then New Year's, and then its relationship with Capricorn and Saturn, there's a ton of polar northern symbolism going on.
And also on New Year's, when they celebrate the New Year, you traditionally have all around the world the pole that they drop the ball down the pole.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So something to consider.
Something I did want to bring up before we start to wrap this up. I did want to mention it earlier, but there was just too many things. We end up going on to the next topic. And
yeah.
I'm not going to say it's, obviously I do think there's many different meanings to lots of symbols and, ideas and stuff. So I'm not saying this is the only thing, but, there was a lot of stuff that you were showing or even explaining, like especially in this picture, did remind me of like a lot of things that I've seen in some of my experiences that I talk about. A lot of it actually was mentioned in this episode. And, I've said before that like when it starts to get very dark and it starts to look like oil spilling up from the ground, it looks a lot like that thing behind the star. And then when I see that, well, for one, again, even when that happens, it starts to look like black goo or something moving. And that made me think of like Saturn because of black, and then Robby mentioned before Aquarius, that is water. So it does kind of look like black water, but it moves, but it does start to come out like that. And it always starts off with this burning little dot that looks like a blazing star. So I'll use some OTO language there.
And that
blazing star
between Capricorn and Aquarius as well. So Capricorn, ruled by Saturn, and Aquarius. So.
Oh, nice, dude.
Yeah. But so I'll have that, and then at some point, when things start to turn, I always mention that it does look like a swastika at some point, and then eventually it will look like that. Even that top picture you showed earlier, where, it will look like to that extent at some point with just the eclipse in the middle, and all that looks like it's spinning.
Right.
Wow. And you talk about like polarization and even that image before, that 5-pointed star. To me, that looked very much like the black circle in front of the white sphere, just broken into 5 pieces.
Right.
That exact symbol. There was something else I saw too, and things that were mentioned. I'll even start to get like rainbows. spinning out of the spiral as well. I don't know if somebody mentioned for some reason I thought about that earlier. I can't remember why, but yeah, like this definitely looks like it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of stone or something in front of something. But yeah, a lot of the things that you were talking about, just in my opinion and from my experiences, even talking about like polarity and the difference of change. When I talk about the experience, again, unfortunately, this isn't anything that I can refer back to or show receipts. These are just my, my visions and my feelings. But, even at some point, it feels like something snaps or something changes and it swings back at me. I know I've mentioned that to you, like a pendulum flying back at me. Even in that, it feels like something changes and the black sphere pulls away from the white one at that point. So, you're talking about two suns. Is that really the black sun, and then is the other one something else? I don't know, but there was a lot of things that were mentioned in this episode tonight that just kept making me think about the vision that I saw is just an artistic way of talking about some of the things you said here.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing, dude. And I know you're all about eyeball symbolism, and just that pupil right there in the middle and the sort of concentric ring nature of the eye. You have that sacred center, right? That inner sanctum, which is the most like potent part of the whole entire system. That's what you're going to find is that symbolically any system, the heart or center of the system is like the most important part of that system. And when you actually start following what I refer to as like polar wisdom, it's actually a lot of it has to do with the heart and heart-based symbolism and following matters relating to the heart, because your heart really is like one of the main symbolic centers in your body. And so that guy W.H. Mueller, who wrote the book Polaria, he really harps on that polar wisdom. Basically, it leads you to the heart and to heart-centeredness, which I think makes just a great deal of sense. And even when people are like talking about looking for the Philosopher's Stone and looking for the Holy Grail, I think it's looking for your center, really. I think it's getting to your inner sanctum. I think that's what it's mostly really all about. I think there are correspondences in the external world, maybe the center of Earth or whatever, but I think it has to do with that sort of inner journey, basically.
In the heart, you have the diametric difference between the mind and the heart. The mind is generally symbolized as masculine, whereas the heart is symbolized as feminine. So this brings us back to this divine feminine energy.
Yeah, exactly, 100%.
Oh, real quick, the reason why I even brought up the rainbow before about the spinning colors is because of bringing up the maypole and the barber pole. Is that I've even mentioned that recently on some shows that if it's like when I try to explain that spiral of colors, I said it reminds me of as if I was like looking under a maypole and watching all that stuff spiral as they wrap around it. It looks very much like that in a sense.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you very much, Mario. That was an awesome presentation. Oh, Headless woke back up. I brought him. Oh, there we go. He's back. I didn't want to wrap it up and the guy's sitting there snoring. There he is. He's back. But yeah, Mario, thank you very much for bringing your presentation. That was a lot of stuff. That was amazing chat. TJ, thank you for bringing yours as well.
I'll just say if people want like a more sort of like I don't know if it's more comprehensive, but it's definitely like more of a structured sort of breakdown. The shows that I get really jazzed for, like podcasts and stuff that I do, and I've never been on before. I have to talk about polar symbolism. I have to talk about the North Star. So I did a show with Higher Side Chats like a handful of months ago, and that's what I brought to the table was all this stuff. And then same thing with my Crow interview. So if people want to hear me talk about this and it's a little bit more structured or whatever, they can check out those episodes.
Awesome. Thank you very much, man. Thank you very much. And TJ, again, thank you very much for bringing your slides. Always appreciate it, sir. We'll go around the room again, and we'll let everybody plug their stuff real quick. Teresa, let everybody know where they can find your work, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mario. I just want to say real quick that the whole Polestar Polaris phenomenon of the constellations rotating around it was what was the moment for me when I realized like the globe is not like a thing. So- or at least how we're taught. So that was like a real like aha moment for me. So I'm so glad you like brought that up in the beginning. But anyways, yeah, people can find me on Spiritual Gangsters podcast and X and Instagram at TS Gangsters Pod.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Robby Marx.
Yeah, if anybody wants to check out my other stuff, from my art to my podcast or any of my social media, you can just go to my Linktree, which is Linktree RMARX R Marx, and that'll bring up everything.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you so much, Mario. That was so inspirational and interesting. And everyone, thank you so much for great ideas. And I'm on all the usual social media and appreciate anyone reaching out always. So
thank you very much for coming on, Ethan. Always appreciate you, sir.
No, thank you.
Headless,
awesome.
Let everybody know where they can find you at, please, sir.
You can find me on YouTube. Just look up the Headless Giant. If you have any stories that you would like to throw at me and put in the mystical mailbag, go ahead and send the email to headlessgiantpodcast@gmail.com. So thank you for having me on.
Of course. Definitely send that man some emails to the mystical mailbag. PMM. And TJ, let everybody know where they can find you at, please.
At Contemporary Problems, and sometimes at Contemporary Problems with the underscore, and you will find me on all platforms or most of them.
Awesome. And if people are still listening, Mario, where can they find you at, sir?
Symbolicstudies.com. One last thing I just want to say, it's so interesting, the relevance of the pole star. Elon Musk's like new division of SpaceX, or new sort of like thing with it, is called Polaris Dawn. That's one thing to know. That's interesting. And then Trump is doing this AI sort of initiative that he's calling Stargate. Right. Yeah. That's the thing, is like, this is the original Stargate. This is the original sort of opening to another dimension or whatever. And then even like, I think it's the Space Force logo. It's like very clearly the pole star, and so there's a ton of examples of this out there. Maybe we can talk about it at some point or whatever, but it is a relevant topic unbeknownst to most people. But anyways, thanks for having me, man. This was really fun.
Oh, of course. Thank you. And everybody's links are in the bottom. And again, I know it was hard for me to try to explain it because there was so many things I had already forgot. But if people have listened to my experience before, and then I guess have listened to this episode, maybe try to get at what I was saying with some of the symbolism. I do think some of it might match some of the stuff I was showing on the screen. And thank you all again. And that is the end of another Occult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.